Hello, I'm Natalia Bilbao, and this is LA Currents. Whether you're about to join the workforce, are a senior employee, or are just about to retire, having knowledge of your health and retirement benefits is crucial. But who promotes and protects these benefits? Well, today I'm excited to be joined by the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Employee Benefits Security Administration, EBSA, of the U.S. Department of Labor, Ali Khawar. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for
Ali.
having me.
So, to someone who is unfamiliar with labor law and employment regulations, how would you describe what the U.S. Department of Labor and the EBSA in particular does?
So if you think of the U.S. system, people that have their benefits through their employment, whether it's things like a 401k, when we say retirement plans, 401ks are the things that people are more familiar with, or a traditional defined benefit pension, or health insurance. If you have those things through your employer, and you're employed by the private sector, so not state or local government, then generally you're under our jurisdiction. And so we're the primary regulator, and our job is several-fold to make sure that those plans are being operated correctly and taking care of the people that they're supposed to take care of, but also educating the public, educating the people that are running the plans, and then we write rules, and there's a policy-making function as well.
So as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary, what exactly does your role entail? So like what type of elements do you oversee?
Every day is a little different, but I mentioned we've got a number of different functions. So the parts that I run are the policy-making and the writing of the rules. Those and the international work that we do as an agency, working with other regulators around the world. Those are the primary things that are kind of, if you looked at an org chart, those are the things that would be under me. But in addition to that, we're not super siloed. I don't think that's a good way to run an organization. So there are other things as well, and in particular, in the public education and public assistance space, that's another area where I and others get pretty involved.
That's so interesting, because one would think like the U.S. Department of Labor is pretty much just working in the U.S. So what type of work do you do with international organizations? What are those conversations like?
It's fascinating conversations because as we're, the fundamental question that we're asking ourselves is, do we have the best system possible? And within the restraints of, the context that we're living in, right? The United States, what's going to work for us? What are the things that other people are doing that we can learn from? So, we might talk to the Australians about an initiative that they're doing. Some of the problems that we face in the U.S. are not unique to us. So across the world, almost every developed economy in almost every country is facing an aging population, which means that birth rates are falling and the average age of the population is getting older and older. That puts strain on whether, in the U.S. it's Social Security, whether it's that program or the equivalent in another country, how you think about making sure that enough people are covered by things like the 401k, have enough health insurance, how they're going to take advantage of those benefits in old age. Those kinds of problems are actually, it's both encouraging and discouraging that they're universal. And so there's a lot that we can gain from having those conversations, and a lot that people can learn from our conversations as well, because our system, especially in the retirement space, is very large and kind of dwarfs any of the other systems around the world because of the amount of money that we have in it.
So in this kind of having to have like one half of you is like sort of like overseeing what is happening in the U.S. and the other half is kind of like listening in on the conversations of other countries. What do you find is the biggest challenge currently in your role?
If I can only pick one, that's going to be really hard. So I'll mention a couple.
You can do like a build-up.
Right.
Like, okay, well, this is one.
So I think one issue is that we're a very, very small agency. We have less than 1,000 people. The kinds of arrangements that I was mentioning, there are about 4 million of them, roughly, in the U.S. So we have under 1,000 people. We have responsibility for 4 million of these arrangements. And there are trillions and trillions of dollars in assets. Depending on what piece you're looking at, there's up to $40 trillion in this universe that we're responsible for.
Wow, sounds like a lot of stress.
Well,
It's a big responsibility.
it's a lot of responsibility,
Yeah.
and part of it is being so small. How can we make sure that we're having the maximum impact? A big
Right.
part of that goes back to what I was saying about public education, right? Making sure that the public is aware of what their rights are, that employers are aware of what their obligations are, that we're making those things as plainly understandable as possible,
Right.
and that people know that they have this resource in the U.S. Department of Labor that's there and available to help.
Let's go back to you a little bit more, because aside from all the things that you do, well, how did it feel for you to be named by President Joe Biden as acting assistant secretary in March of 2021? As a first generation American, like, how did it feel to achieve this milestone?
Yeah, it was an exciting moment for me. I have been working in this area for a long time, and I'm very familiar with the agency's work. But to take on that role at a really critical time in the juncture of the U.S., but also of my agency, we were also, like everyone else, in the midst of COVID at that time. We were doing a lot of work around COVID, around how people can pay or not pay, as the case was ultimately for vaccines, how those can be financed, work around what the obligations were of employers, how we could relax certain rules for employers and make sure that there was more flexibility for employees in that very, very unique context of COVID. And we had at the time a workforce that had transitioned to being fully remote, which was, that's not the way we traditionally work. It's not the way we work now. So there were a lot of things that we needed to focus on, and it was a particularly kind of exhilarating time to take on that role. And then, on a personal level, being an immigrant, coming into the U.S., not really, when I was 5 years old, I don't know that I saw myself as being a political official in the U.S. government, and I wasn't really interested in politics when I was young. So to take on that role, really, it was kind of another step in a long arc.
I'm so curious. So if it wasn't something that you kind of dreamt about, what was it that triggered that desire to serve your community?
Yeah, I've found it in a lot of conversations. It's not typical that people, at age 5, my son's 7. I'm pretty sure if I ask him, he's not talking about becoming an employee benefits lawyer when he grows up. Astronaut, firefighter, those things are on the list.
Yeah.
I think it was, as you said, a desire to really serve and help people leave my community and all of the communities in the U.S. better off than they were as a result of the work. And that really is kind of, I think, for me, an animating principle.
You brought up the pandemic, obviously, with its own set of challenges, because I know that you worked in the EBSA in other roles. You were an inspector, I believe. And so what was the pivot for you from what did you see the department, how did it change, from kind of like the plan that you had set forth, and then when the pandemic hit, how did that change, and how were you able to pivot and put, regulations forth?
Yeah, one thing that made us, I think, very fortunate is that we've had a number of staff that are quite long tenured. And so that transition, kind of figuring out how a team can work when they're remote rather than in person, that part was relatively easy. The part that maybe we were more nervous about is one of the functions that we have is a toll-free line. You can call, someone will answer if it's during normal business hours, and they'll try and give you an answer or resolve an issue if you have it with your employee benefit plan. Those individuals, we call them our benefits advisors, they also go out and do educational events in communities. Their jobs change really dramatically because the calls that we were taking were always in the office. People were sitting in an office, in a cube or an office, and taking those calls. They were interacting with their coworkers.
Right.
What's the quick answer to this question? All of those kinds of things, and obviously going out and doing community events, all completely transformed during the pandemic.
Right.
We did manage to transform that to a completely remote function. The education part was, I think, very hard.
Sure.
But the taking calls from the public was really important to us. It is one of our central obligations, we feel. And we were able to continue doing that, which was really both, I probably shouldn't say luck because it worked out, but there was an element of luck and planning. We had been trying to figure out how we could introduce more flexibility for those folks. And it just kind of coincided where at about the time that we were getting close from a technology perspective, we had to rush a little bit, but things were about ready, because one of the concerns we had is we don't want people to have to be at home and calling from their personal phones.
Right.
It should show up, when you're getting a call that this is the U.S. government phone number, and it took a little while to get that technology right. We were able to do that right as the pandemic began.
And I also imagine like the volume of calls must have like skyrocketed as well, because I mean, COVID saw a lot of people unfortunately losing their health coverage. So how did you
there were
address
those
that?
issues, and we have had experience a few times where our call volume will spike pretty significantly, and so we have ways to try and manage that. One of the things that happened also during COVID is that ordinarily if you lose your job, you have to pay a pretty significant price to maintain your health insurance. There's a law called COBRA, and it allows you to keep your health insurance, but your employer no longer has to kind of kick in the employer portion. And so for some people, that sticker shock leads them to forego continuing that health insurance. Now with the Affordable Care Act, you have the exchanges, and people will often transition to that. One of the things that happened actually during the COVID period is there was a temporary subsidy that was enacted. So for those people, they were able to come in, get a subsidy from the government to cover that employer portion and maintain that coverage that they had before. That was really important. People obviously had questions, employers had questions, participants had questions, and so we were taking a lot of calls for that especially.
Was the education portion of that then essential for that to sort of like transition forward?
It was, and actually one of the things
smoothly?
that we did is we launched a social media campaign, which I mentioned that we were small. We're also small in budget, so we haven't really traditionally had the budget to do kind of the kind
large
of
scale.
the kind of social media campaigns
Yeah.
we've done traditionally are the maybe what you would expect
more
from a government
grassroots.
agency.
Got it.
But we were able to temporarily hire people with a lot of expertise in the space, and do social media ads, and in particular test for different kinds of audiences, which is a thing that we'd wanted to do for a long time but just hadn't had the resources to.
Right.
And that was, I think, particularly helpful because it helped to make sure that people understand how they could sign up, what they were getting under the law, who they could contact, and resolved some of the questions so people didn't even need to call us in the first place.
So we talked about the COVID pandemic, which in of itself then brought alongside the mental health epidemic, or really highlighted that. And I know you're a strong advocate for the importance of, letting people know that, hey, your health benefits are not just sort of like physical health benefits, but also mental. So tell me a little bit about that.
Finding benefits from that COVID period is hard, but one of the things that I believe is that unlike prior to the pandemic, when we had a mental health epidemic in the country, and a substance use epidemic, particularly with opioids, those things didn't appear when we all went home. But when we started experiencing that social isolation, those feelings of loneliness, the stress, the fear of what was going to come, I think it opened a window that I would say I really don't think I've seen, at least in the recent past in the U.S., in which there was a level of openness and acceptance of mental health conditions not being, at worst kind of a reflection on the caliber of that human being,
Right.
but a disease just like any other, right? We don't tend to judge someone if they have a heart attack or if they break their leg.
You have a video that's really informative, actually, that like showcases two cases of different workers. One has diabetes, and he's kind of follows like the normal route, and nobody questions anything.
Right.
It's covered. And then when somebody claims they have like a like a substance abuse problem or addiction problem, then that's a whole other ballgame.
It's suddenly their fault. But the truth is, these are diseases just like any other.
Right.
And there's been a law in place actually for over a decade. It's on the cusp of celebrating its 16th anniversary. It's called the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act. MAPIA is how people refer to it. You don't really need to know any of that. The important thing is it stands for a pretty fundamental proposition that if the condition you're seeking treatment for is a mental health condition or a substance use condition, it shouldn't be treated differently just because it's that condition, right, than it would if it was a traditional medical or a physical condition. So, The simple example is if you think of someone that, my son recently sprained his ankle. He didn't need to go to physical therapy, but if he did, I wouldn't be worried that my health insurance company would say, no, 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 no. He doesn't really need it. He's only going to get so many visits. The same should be true if someone has mild depression that can be treated on an outpatient basis. You can get, visit a therapist for a certain amount of times. And those limits that you put on should really be the same for both. It shouldn't be different because, we've decided that you're less deserving if you have a mental health condition or you have a substance use condition. It is an area where not only did the pandemic kind of open people's eyes to the extent of these conditions in the US, but it also was a priority for this administration, a very early priority for it. The Biden-Harris administration. And you saw in the president's first State of the Union, he talked about mental health and mental health parity as part of what he called his unity agenda. It was one of the pillars of that agenda. And from the very beginning of my time in this role, we made mental health and addressing some of the longstanding issues a very high priority. So it became our number one enforcement priority. What we found truly unfortunately is that for many people in the US that have health insurance coverage, that pretty simple proposition, that simple promise that it shouldn't matter wasn't the case, that it did matter, that you had to jump through additional hoops, that you had to cut through additional red tape for no reason except you're trying to get treatment for a mental health condition or a substance use condition. And the part that really I think I found the most bothersome is that, I'm a parent, and a lot of what you saw during the pandemic, and one of the things that did change a little bit, is there was, in addition to the mental health epidemic, there was a teen mental health epidemic that also preceded. But there you saw actually an exponential increase in particularly body image issues, and particularly around adolescent females. My kids are much younger, but that really kind of hit home for me, that you have, you can imagine as a parent how hard it is for your child to have any health condition and how much that distracts you, the stress that you have with that. But then on top of that, when you're reaching out for help, on top of everything else that you're dealing with and the worries that you have for your child, you now have to fight again and again and again, a system that is designed to say no and not help you get the care that your child needs. That really is not the way that the system should work. That's our kind of pretty firm conviction. And so we've been working to try and address that as much as possible. That has been not just through enforcement work. We've done a lot of public education. There again was a social media campaign. The videos that you saw were part of that. A lot of public speaking about it. And also we, just this year, updated what the rules are to again make it much, much more clear that a lot of what we would see, things like, you mentioned diabetes earlier, that people would be able to, middle-aged men could get nutritional counseling for diabetes, but teenage girls that had an eating disorder couldn't get nutritional counseling, that it would be just fundamentally excluded. We're not going to cover nutritional counseling if it's for that. Now, that doesn't mean that nutritional counseling is the be-all, end-all if you have an eating disorder, but it is part of what is kind of a well-rounded set of practices to make sure that you're getting the help you need. Things like that, children with autism not being able to get access to ABA therapy, those kinds of things really, really bothered us. The other one that really sticks out in my head is individuals that had opioid disorders. Part of the treatment plan there is very typically testing to make sure that you haven't relapsed. And we would find instance after instance where urinalysis, testing your urine to see if you've taken a substance, wasn't covered, even though it is for any number of conditions on the physical and medical side. So we've been really trying to do that. The new rule that we put out really focuses on the core issue of ensuring that this parity exists between medical and mental health.
I mean, that's why obviously, getting good health coverage is top of the list when someone is applying for a job, and getting certain guarantees like also child care coverage and things like that. So we've covered health coverage. Let's talk about retirement, because I know how important the retirement security rule is for your department. And can you tell me a little bit more about it? What type of protections are you putting in place to secure this?
Yeah. So when you look at the U.S. system, many people are not covered. About half the population doesn't have coverage. But for that half that's covered, and so I highlight that because there's kind of two different prongs to our work. One is thinking a lot about how we can expand that and have as many people have this opportunity as possible. For the people that are able to save through their workplace, you know, maybe they have what's called automatic enrollment, automatic deductions coming out of their paycheck. Over the course of a 30-year career, they've managed to amass a pretty healthy nest egg. One issue that we've seen and have been trying to address for a number of years is that for most of us, you're not a financial professional.
Right.
And you know, when you're in this 401k system, you're asked to make a lot of decisions about, you know, how much should you save, what should you invest in, ultimately, how should you withdraw the money when you retire. It's different than the traditional system of, you know, 20 or 30 years ago even, where people had what we call defined benefit, the traditional pension, right? You showed up to work, you worked, and at the end you got a paycheck for life, and your widow maybe as well.
Right.
That's not the reality for most Americans today. And so what we've done as a system, as a country, is we've shifted a lot of that decision making to the individual. We haven't associated that with another shift of, you know, we're going to make sure that people have the financial expertise to make all of these decisions. We've just told them, you're now responsible for these decisions. If you make the wrong decision, that's kind of on you, right? If you don't save enough from your paycheck, if you don't invest the right way, if the market doesn't perform the way that we expect that it will, and you don't have enough money at retirement, there's no employer backstop the way that there is for a pension. Like, no one's going to kick in the amount that you should have saved. And so the natural thing for most people to do is, well, I don't know anything about this. Who can I talk to that does know about it? And that's where the really important role of financial advisors comes in. So there's a whole class of people whose job it is, among other things, is to help you figure out how should I invest, how much money should I be taking out of my paycheck, what am I going to do to finance the retirement that I want. Right? I want to be able to see my grandkids. They're living across the country. You know, I want to be able to go on an international vacation with my spouse. You know, this is what I know about my family medical history and my expectations around health expenditures when I'm older. All of those kinds of things. And it's incredibly important to have people that can help you talk through that, work through that, and put numbers to that, right? And say, okay, well, this is the plan that we're going to put in place. That's all fantastic. The problem is that most people don't realize that for most of those financial advisors, they don't have a legal obligation to be putting your interests first. So they could, for example, be recommending that you invest in a stock, a mutual fund.
I heard you were in a conference recently and somebody said they invested all their money in like a life insurance policy.
And that happens as well, right? And the product that they recommend you invest in, they're recommending perhaps because it's going to earn them a higher commission. Right. You know, we expect this maybe when you're on a used car sales lot, right? That you're going to get that kind of hard charging sales pitch, and your guard is up. You don't think that the person you're dealing with is looking out for you. You know, the question we're all asking ourselves when we're engaged in those transactions is, okay, well, what's the catch? What's the catch? What's the catch? That's not the relationship people have with their financial advisors. It shouldn't be the relationship that they have with their financial advisors. So the rule that we've worked on is really, it's a pretty basic proposition that when you're getting that kind of advice from someone, when they're telling you that they're going to look out for you, that they're going to provide you with that advice that really is about you and what you need, and everything about that relationship is about putting your interests first, that's a standard that they're held to, rather than being able to kind of promise something up front and then not be held to that standard if unfortunately something went wrong.
So what are some of the things you hope will be put in place to make sure that your kids and our youngsters have the safety they need and the information they need to not fall into these places of complete despair of not knowing what's going to happen to their retirement plans or their health coverage? What are some of the things that you hope the department will address or bring forth, or the system?
I think the work around public education is really important. There's one really important lesson that I certainly didn't know when I was entering the workforce, which is the importance of saving early. Right, the $1,000 that you put away when you're 22 is worth so much more than the $1,000 you save when you're 50, because what happens is it goes into that account and it earns money, and it grows and grows and grows, and it can mean a difference of tens of thousands of dollars ultimately over the course of your career. So I think that absolutely is one lesson that I'm going to be teaching my kids if I'm fortunate enough to be around when they enter the workforce. Is, you have to make sure that you're participating in the 401k or whatever arrangement they have, taking advantage of the employer match. People sometimes, when they're looking at their paycheck, and they think, oh, it's going to be really hard for me to max out that employer match, and so I'm going to save a little bit less, or I'm not going to save. But there is a trade-off there. You're trading off a lot, and particularly with the employer match, that's free money, right? That is part of your paycheck that you're giving back to your employer, which generally employers are very happy to accept that. They don't need to pay out the money if they don't have to. But that is an area where I think it's especially important for people to be paying close attention to make sure that you're, at the very least, taking advantage of all of the compensation your employer is offering you.
So it's been how long that you've been working for the EBSA?
For most of the last 20 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Long career. So 20 years, what would you say has been your biggest accomplishment?
One is that I don't think I have any kind of personal accomplishments. It is a team effort, and whether I've been in a support role or a leadership role, there's not a thing that I think I've done on my own. Anyone that suggests the contrary is not telling the truth, because there's a fantastic team I work with, and they've done a lot of really phenomenal things over the years. The one area I would highlight actually goes back to the Obama administration, and it used to be the case that fees that you paid for investing in your 401k were actually much, much, much higher than they are now. We introduced a lot more transparency into that space, particularly for small employers, and we've seen fees drop really significantly as a result of that. And that fundamentally translates into money in people's pockets.
Yeah.
We've done a ton of enforcement work that I'm very proud of. We're now, when I talk to college and law students, I think we're still in the arena where they remember Bernie Madoff. We were one of the government agencies that was very involved in that prosecution. College students don't remember this anymore, but we were the first. I do
remember that, yes.
Well, the first agency to open an investigation on Enron, actually, as well. So there are a lot of these kinds of instances where we've been actually very successful in protecting the American public and making sure that the benefits that they've worked really hard for.
Setting a precedent, because that really did set a precedent.
Enron did, yes. Yeah. And making sure that money is protected and it's where it belongs, which is in the pockets of the people that worked hard for it.
I love it, saving people money.
Yeah.
So how can people get in touch with your department for any advice, to access resources?
Yeah, so there's a lot of material on our website, which is dol.gov/EBSA. But you can also just call us. That toll-free number I mentioned, it's 866-444-3272. And like I said, we've got about 130 people across the country whose job it is to take those calls. They're very highly educated, and sometimes it's a very simple question and can get a very simple answer. Other times it involves, dealing with a health insurance company, dealing with an employer, and sorting out what the problem is and resolving it for you. And we're happy to do both.
Thank you so much, Ali, for spending some time with us today discussing your role and, of course, the work being done at the Employee Benefits Security Administration of the U.S. Department of Labor.
Thanks for having me.
This is Natalia Bilbao for LA Currents. Thank you so much for watching.